a story to share this. I've had the great opportunity and the good sense to have people with disability become my friend, and to have opportunity to listen to a lot of people with disabilities. And that's, I really encourage you to take those experiences and listen to what people have to say. A friend of mine, Ray Gagney, was on the board of directors of the Arc of the United States. When I went to work there, and over time he and I became friends. Ray used to go out sometime when I was speaking, and he would speak with me because he had a very compelling story. But I was editing a textbook in the mid-'90s, and I wanted a person with a disability to write the foreword to this. And Ray and I called Ray and I said, "Would you do this?" And he was not very comfortable about it, but he said, "Sure." Eventually, I said, "Just answer the question: why is self-determination important to you?" And so he faxed me this a foreword for this text, which I forwarded immediately to the publisher. He says, "When I moved to New Bedford, I wanted to open a checking account." So this was maybe the mid-1960s, when checking or cash were the only options. There weren't somebody like Ray could never get a credit card in the mid-1960s. He didn't have a credit history. There was no such thing as a debit card. So for him, having a checking account was a really critical part of being able to live independently in his community. So he goes over to the bank, he gives them the $10 to open the account, and asks them if there's a problem, and they said no. But when he went back a couple days later, he says that they said they couldn't understand his signature and that he couldn't have an account. Now, Ray's signature was not very good. It was, at times it was an X, but mainly Ray had cerebral palsy, and it was usually just some sort of a mark. I would comment parenthetically that my signature is really pretty much just a mark these days. Too many years of graduate training will do that to you. It's got a squiggle at the front and a line. Nobody's ever denied me the opportunity to spend my money with them. So, this was clearly pre-AD Americans with Disabilities Act discrimination kinds of things. For many Americans with disabilities, particularly of Ray's area, here's where this story ends. They've been taught they're the problem. They haven't had experiences that could teach them differently. This is where it ends. They said no, that's it. What are the consequences? No checking account, no opportunity to live more independently. These can have dire consequences. But for Ray, it wasn't the end of the story. He says, "I thought about this and I realized that I'd had a checking account before I moved." So he had an experience with something that he showed that he could do it. Ray had all sorts of support. He was not able to do any of these things independently. But, and he says, and that had worked fine. So he says, basically what he doesn't say here, but is important to note in terms of the issue of self-determination, is so I developed a plan. So he developed a plan and he put it in place. So he got up and he put on a suit and tie because he knew that bankers could relate more and would respect somebody who presented themselves in a manner that was consistent with that. And he went down to the main branch where he knew that he could probably get some action, and he asked to see the bank president. He didn't go to the teller and say, this is a problem, because he knew that if he was going to get any change, he was going to have to act. So he did all this, and he says, they told me he was in a meeting, and he told them, "I'll wait right here." Now, in places like this, pre-ADA often, the strategy was get them out any way you can. We don't want these kind of people in our business. It's bad for our business. So when Ray said, "I'm not moving, I'm not going out voluntarily," they went plan B. So plan B is 2 minutes later, the president comes out and escorts him out of the bank lobby area and into his office. And he brought him in a room and asked me what the problem was. And Ray said, "I told him I also brought my canceled checks, and I showed them I had an account before." He apologized, and I got my checking account. And that is why self-determination is important to me. And if you think about life is all about solving one little problem after another. If you can't navigate these and don't have the supports to be able to do that, then you're not going to be very successfully about living independently in your community. These types of issues, problem solving, goal setting, having a plan, advocating for yourself, and believing that you're not the problem are critical. So what is self-determination? We've defined self-determination, self-determined behavior as volitional actions, you know why, that enable one to act as the primary causal agent in one's life and to maintain or improve one's quality of life. A causal agent is just someone who causes or makes things to happen in his or her own life. And I think that by being self-determined, our really goals and objectives are to improve our quality of life. Now, I put Wile E. Coyote here just to illustrate something. I think it's, I think we need to be provocative about some of these issues. In virtually every Roadrunner cartoon, Wiley orders some sort of chemical or gunpowder or something that will make him faster or build him something that will enable him to catch the Roadrunner. And what always happens is that he mixes these things, and there's this deadly combination that blows up, and he walks away, and he's soot covered and exuding smoke and everything. And that really, I think, is the image I want to leave around this issue of causing things to happen in your life. Think about the old Frankenstein movies, how there's always, the black and white mixing of these chemicals. We all know now that it's just dry ice, right? But it's got this billowing, and you mix these chemicals. It's that kind of notion of causing things to happen. Those are called causal agents, right? Chemical agent. A chemical agent is something that when mixed with something else causes something dramatic to happen. And that's what I like to think of in terms of causal agency. People making things happen in their lives. And we need to enable people to do that in ways that are most efficient and most effective. They're going to do it in other ways, I firmly believe. People are going to act in ways that try to improve their quality of life, even if it's something that we believe is not an appropriate way. So how do we become self-determined? Well, it's a combination. We certainly can attain developmental milestones and learn a set of skills that enable us to solve problems more effectively, to set goals, to advocate for ourselves, and those kinds of things. So certainly being able to communicate what you want is an important component of that. Now, the point being, it's not about making your own decision. It's about being involved in those decisions. And, making a decision, the decision-making process is something that, as an educator, I can task analyze. I can break that process down into 10 steps. I can break it into 20 steps, whatever I need to. And I bet there's 2 or 3 steps in there that I can teach about anyone so that they can become maximally participating in their own lives. But it's not just teaching people skills, and self-determination itself is not a skills. There are skills and knowledge that lead you to be able to be more self-determined, but it's also about opportunity, the opportunity to assume some control over your life, as opposed to having someone do things for you all the time. And think about people with disabilities. I mean, it is often the much easier course of action to do something to or for the person rather than wait for them to do it themselves. You see it all the time in schools, when you've got the end of the year or the end of the day bell, and there's a child very slowly getting a coat on. Someone will come up and do that. They'll button it for them. There's just this real tendency to do things to and for people with disabilities. And what we need to do is we need to back off, and we need to enable and support them to do those things. And then these notions of frequent experience of choice and control. And then the supports and accommodations that we all need. I don't have a lot of time. The role of technology in our lives. I use the GPS, mapping process to get myself around cities that I don't know where. I would be lost without some of the things. There are similar things that we can tool and make for people with disabilities that will enable them and support them to do things that they might not otherwise have done. So there's lots of supports and accommodations, including friends and family members and co-workers. So why do we focus on self-determination? First of all, I think, as I mentioned when we started, we're changing ways of thinking about disability, and new paradigms of disability view disability as a function of the fit between the person's capacities and the context in which that person needs to function. So historically, what we've done is we've defined disability by measuring personal incompetence. So if you fail IQ tests and you fail adaptive behavior tests, those are both measures of personal competence, but if you fail them, they become measures of personal incompetence. Then you get diagnosed as having intellectual disability. But historically, disability is seen to reside within the person. It's the person that is in some way broken or pathological or atypical or aberrant. Choose your field. There are all sorts of terms that are used to refer to people, but the assumption is this disability resides within the person. We prove that by measuring their incompetence. Of course, that creates a circumstance of very low expectations. And frankly, people with disabilities have achieved so much, including people with the most severe disabilities, that these types of understandings of disabilities simply are inconsistent with what people are doing now. We can no longer hold these kinds of beliefs because we've been proven wrong, that people aren't broken, that if provided the right kinds of supports, they can achieve a lot of outcomes. So led by organizations like the World Health Organization's classification system, the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disability Systems, we're moving to look at disability in a very different way, where what we're looking at is personal competence. What skills, abilities, capacities, gifts do people have? What are the demands of the environment and the context? There's a picture of a home here, but in my work, we're working a lot with curriculum and modifying curriculum so that if you can't read, you can still learn the things that are in the curriculum, because for many people, a barrier to knowledge acquisition is, in fact, that they can't read, but there's a lot of information. So we can modify the curriculum as an example of the context. So very broadly cast in terms of environment context. And disability resides only right here in the fit between personal capacity and the requirements of functioning in the environment. And if we can reduce that gap, if we can close that so that there isn't a gap, then fundamentally we've mitigated the effect of the disability. So these, so these types of models are really important for a number of reasons. First of all, if we're back in the old model of deficit and impairment and disabilities residing within the person, what are we going to do? We're going to have to fix, cure, change in some way the person, right? Doesn't work. Tried it for 40 years. Time to move on. We typically can do very little about fixing or changing or curing the person. If we don't have to worry about that anymore, we can say, what is it that people do well? What are the demands? How can we increase what people do well? How can we change the demands of the environment? How can we change the work site so that people can succeed in that? What kinds of supports? And how can we reduce that gap? It's a very empowering way to approach disability for those of us that work in the field of disability, because it takes the monkey off our back of coming up with whatever it is that's going to cure or fix or change. We're not worried about that. We're interested in supporting people, enhancing capacity, and changing contexts in ways. And we know how to do this. The ADA's most obvious impact has been on access for people with physical disabilities. In years past, if you couldn't walk, you didn't get up the stairs. You didn't get to have access to a lot of things. But now we have buildings that are universally designed. We have curb cuts that serve, that's a perfectly legitimate way of changing the context so that someone who uses a wheelchair can, in fact, access the environment. We know how to do this. We know how to do it for cognitive access. We know how to do it for physical and sensory access as well. And technology can play a big role in that as well. These are important. These are strengths-based. We get to focus with people on what they do well. They focus on the environment, the context, not fixing the person, and they emphasize supports, not programs. And supports here are resources and strategies that promote the interest and causes of people with and without disability, that enable them to access greater opportunities, information, relationships, and result in enhanced interdependence. Again, we're using this, none of us are independent. We're all dependent upon one another. Resulting in enhanced interdependence, productivity, community inclusion, life satisfaction, and human functioning. Really, a support is anything that can achieve these kinds of outcomes. It can be monetary support. It can be a disability system like VR or special education or any other. It can be friends and families. It can be technology. Teaching and education is a type of support. We enable people to enhance interdependence, those kinds of things, because we teach them a set of skills. So very broadly cast. And I would, we talk about an array of supports. And it begins, though, the most natural support, the most important support is the person, him or herself, right in the center of this. The more we enable people to do for themselves, the less somebody else has to do for them. So at the heart of these ways of thinking about disability are enhancing personal capacity and enabling the person to be his or her own support. And then we move out to friends and families and non-paid supports like co-workers and neighbors and people in our religious communities. And then we move to kind of generic services that are out there, the bus system, the whatever system. And then finally we move out to these disability specialized supports. But if we begin out here, we're not going to achieve the goals of enhancing the quality of lives of people. There's not enough people, time, or resources. There simply isn't in these systems. We have to begin here with the person, and we have to move out so that we can create layers and array of supports. We focus on self-determination because it's consistent with and really at the core of new paradigms of disability. It is important to people with disabilities, and we've shown through research that people with disabilities who are more self-determined, particularly as they leave school, achieve more positive adult outcomes. Pearl Buck, and going back to its importance to people with disabilities, Pearl Buck won the 1938 Nobel Prize, the 1932 Pulitzer Prize for her writing. The Good Earth was the Pulitzer Prize winning novel. And she was, and Pearl Buck, by the way, was the mother of a child with a disability. She had a daughter with phenylketonuria, PKU. You won't meet very many people with PKU because there's been a dietary treatment to PKU. But anyway, she was really instrumental ultimately in the history of the growth of the parent movement in our society. But she was writing about people who lived in countries that at that time, like China, who had no personal freedoms, who were living in dictatorial states. And she says, none who have ever been free can understand the terrible, fascinating power of the hope of freedom to those who are not. And I think that very eloquently captures what those of us who don't have a disability or who haven't had the experiences that many people with disabilities have to understand. We simply cannot understand the terrible, fascinating power of the hope of freedom or the hope for self-determination that the experience of having a disability often results in. So I think we have to understand that and act accordingly. We have multiple research studies showing that self-determination status predicts a higher quality of life, that it's positively correlated with more positive post-secondary outcomes. Kids who leave high school as more self-determined young people have better employment-related outcomes, have better independent living-related outcomes, better community inclusion-related outcomes. They're more engaged in personally valued recreation and leisure activities. So we know that this is something that can enhance the quality of life for people. With I've mentioned that students with cognitive disabilities who leave school as self-determined young people, a whole host of things. I'm not going to read those, but a whole host of outcomes. In fact, we did this research, and one study was following up a third year out. So students had left high school 3 years earlier. We had a 30-item questionnaire about what what people were doing with their lives, and were they working, were they, did they get out in the community, how often did they go to a restaurant, did they have friends, did you get, just a whole host of things, trying to capture some snapshot of the quality of the person's life. And we had two groups, kids who'd left school who were not very self-determined, kids who'd left school who were more self-determined, and there wasn't a single question, not a single question among those 30 that the kids in the lower self-determination group scored better than the kids in the higher self-determination. And that was controlling for IQ, it was controlling for a lot of variables. So there's always a need for more evidence, but I think I feel very comfortable saying that we know for a fact that if we enhance personal quality, these issues of self-determination, we're going to enhance the quality of life. So, and these slides talk a little bit more about some of these things. First of all, research shows that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are less self-determined than their non-disabled peers. But you need to understand that says nothing about whether they can be self-determined or not. It says something about the opportunities that they have or the lack thereof. It says something about the low expectations to which people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are held that limit that. So this says nothing about the fact that, and I happen to believe that most people with intellectual and developmental disabilities can be very self-determined. We know some things about what contributes to self-determination, and there are some personal characteristics. If you've got better adaptive behavior skills, you're going to be more self-determined. Certainly, people who have more cognitive ability are able to solve more complex problems. And so it's easier, I think, to become self-determined. But again, it's not about solving your own problems. It's about causing things to happen in your life. And so, people who can't solve those problems can equally become self-determined. But, and in fact, I would just point out, we've collected data on thousands of people over the last 20 years using self-report measures of self-determination, including lots of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And there's always a significant but fairly low correlation in the neighborhood of 0.15 to 0.23, 0.24 between IQ level and self-determination scores. And if you know anything about the statistics of that, if you get a large enough sample, you can get, it becomes statistically significant. But what's compelling about that is really how low the correlation really is. If IQ were destiny with regard to self-determination, we'd be looking at correlations on the average of 0.50 and 0.60 between a 0.0 and 1.0. So, a correlation of 0.15 suggests that it's practically, it's not meaningless, but it's not nearly as important as a lot of other things, and that we can in fact enable people to become more self-determined even if IQ, they have lower IQs. People with disabilities themselves rank self-determination as very important. In fact, the studies have looked at comparisons between, say, families and professionals and people with disabilities. People with disabilities always rank these things as more important. A lot of people who work in the field, at least of special education, think this is important, but they will also tell you that they think that the student's type of disability, impacts whether they should focus on issues of self-determination. It's that misunderstanding that self-determination is independent performance. I think for kids with the most severe disabilities, it's even more important than for kids with learning disabilities who may have a lot of these capacities already. But it's really important for all kids. And in fact, in our work of the last 5 years, our work has been with all kids, not kids with and without, not just kids with disabilities, because these are issues that are part of child and adolescent development. And I think that issues of becoming a self-determined young person are probably as important a developmental outcome for all adolescents as any other. And that there's, if you know adolescents, you know that we do have some work to go on getting them thinking in ways about making decisions and solving problems and not just acting according to what feels good. Parents of students with disabilities have acknowledged that this is important.